This is a film based on a true story, and also a terrifying thriller that kept millions of viewers holding their breath until the very last half. It must be admitted that the real events portrayed in the film completely shattered human understanding, causing many viewers to question the authenticity of the story. This incident happened in 2012 in Aberdeenshire, Scotland, where a ship named Talos was preparing to head to the Huntington oilfield work zone for pipeline maintenance. In fact, on the seabed of the world's oceans, there is a network of pipelines totaling more than 30,000 kilometers, and these pipelines are maintained by specially trained saturation divers. Their working depth reaches over 300 meters, making it one of the most dangerous jobs on Earth. This time, they were divided into 3 teams, each with 3 members, and they prepared to pressurize to a depth of over 100 meters for maintenance. After reaching the destination, they activated the computer-controlled dynamic positioning system, and all the data appeared normal. Under the captain's command, the supervisor Craig informed the first team to get ready for the dive, with the experienced Duncan leading the other 2 members into the pressurization chamber. And as a precaution, Duncan checked that the other 2 divers carried all their necessary tools before entering the cramped diving bell. Throughout the entire process, the control center had to monitor everything in real time. After separating from the decompression chamber, the first team's diving bell would be moved above the moon pool, and then the deep-sea monitoring system would be activated. Every step of the operation required perfect teamwork from everyone involved. As the crew operated, the first diving bell slowly descended into the ocean, and for every 100 feet it descended, the control center updated the divers until they reached the target depth of 300 feet. Under Craig's guidance, the 3 opened the hatch and prepared for the dive. The turbulent currents of the seabed were nothing new to them, and they treated the surface storms as just another routine day. However, it was crucial to activate the hot water circulation system, as the divers needed to gradually adapt to the frigid temperatures of the seabed. Once all preparations were complete, David was the first to enter the water, followed by Chris, while Duncan remained inside the diving bell to assist and support them. The deep-sea monitoring system followed them closely to prevent any accidents. David and Chris soon reached the work site smoothly, and after successfully powering up the manifold, the seabed instantly lit up with a different scene. David's task was to install the oil pipeline, while Chris was responsible for pressure balancing at wellhead number 3. At this point, all systems showed normal status on the monitors, but just as they were about to complete their tasks, the sonar positioning system suddenly showed a signal loss. No one knew the cause of the malfunction, and what terrified them even more were the endless alarm sounds blaring from the system.
The thrusters have gone offline.
How many?
All of them.
I'm getting the same here, Captain.
Chris, the ship's
Moving, get out of there now.
What? Dave, can you repeat? The ship is moving. Get out of the manifold right now.
Duncan raced against time, trying to extend the umbilical cable as much as possible, because if the distance from the diving bell became too far and the umbilical cable broke, oxygen supply would be cut off, putting David and Chris's lives at grave risk. But just as David and Chris hurried toward the top of the manifold, Chris's umbilical cable was accidentally stuck. It turned out a sudden violent storm had caused the ship to spin uncontrollably, drifting off its target location, and the power cable was instantly torn apart, plunging the manifold area into complete darkness. Meanwhile, Duncan had extended the umbilical cable to its limit, but under the storm's impact, the diving bell swung violently and the cable was stretched to its maximum. The worst thing they feared still happened.
Bill, I need slack on diver 1.
There is no more slack. I can't get to you.
I can't breathe.
Chris, switch to your bailout. Otherwise, you'll burn through your backup gas. Understand?
Chris's loss of contact threw them into utter despair, and the backup oxygen could only last 10 minutes. They couldn't imagine how they would rescue their teammate in just 10 minutes. Fortunately, at this time, the deep-sea camera feed was restored, but what they saw was only David returning to the diving bell, with no trace of Chris. Colleagues from other teams were equally anxious, pacing restlessly. Craig, as the supervisor, couldn't hold back his anger and yelled at the captain, questioning why they hadn't dropped anchor to stop the ship from drifting. But the captain argued that doing so could cause a seabed oil pipeline leak, which would lead lead to even worse consequences. As each second passed, Chris's life at the bottom of the sea entered a countdown. He held a flare, trying to signal his colleagues, but with the umbilical cable severed, there was no way to contact them. Chris couldn't see the diving bell at all and was completely lost. He pulled out a compass, trying to find the manifold at 90 degrees east. Only by reaching the top of the manifold might he be spotted by his teammates. Meanwhile, the control center ruled out propulsion system failure, and the captain ordered an immediate shutdown of the computer control, switching to manual mode to stop the ship's drift. Even though his colleagues reminded him that any operational error might cause the entire ship to capsize, the captain was still determined to do everything to rescue Chris.
DPO, put her in manual.
When Chris had only 4 minutes and 30 seconds of oxygen left, he finally found the manifold and had to climb to the top as fast as possible for any hope of being rescued. But as the oxygen ran low, his movements slowed even more. When Chris struggled to the top of the manifold, he saw no sign of anyone, not even the diving bell. He instantly fell into despair, and only images of his wife kept flashing in his mind. As his oxygen ran out completely, Chris eventually collapsed. At this moment, the ship was still being battered by giant waves, and the dynamic positioning system had not yet returned to normal. The captain ordered an immediate alternative plan, but the only fortunate thing was that with everyone's joint effort, the deep-sea camera finally recovered. Everyone stared wide-eyed, carefully searching for the missing Chris. As the camera slowly moved upward, they finally found Chris lying weakly on the manifold. Chris kept his eyes closed with no signs of breathing, and his limbs occasionally twitched, which was an involuntary spasm caused by severe brain hypoxia. They knew all too well that after 5 minutes without oxygen, neurological damage could occur, and after 10 minutes, massive brain cell death would follow. By now, Chris had already been without oxygen for more than 7 minutes.
Can grab the D-ring on his harness with the pincers from the ROV.
The ROVs are only ever used for body recoveries, okay? The pincers are far too dangerous to be used on anything alive.
I can't see any other options. Can you?
Look, Chris is alive right now, okay?
But these lads are my responsibility. I'm going to take the controls.
As the supervisor, Craig had to take full responsibility, racing against time to rescue his diver. In such circumstances, the greater the pressure, the harder it was to operate steadily. He had to calm himself down, reduce the power of the forward thrusters, and make the rear thrusters run at full capacity to stabilize the camera more easily. After repeated failures, Craig's fourth attempt finally succeeded, grabbing the D-ring, and they were instantly overwhelmed with excitement. But just as they prepared to ascend, they encountered a new problem. Chris seemed to be stuck by something and couldn't be moved at all. When they switched to the bottom camera, they discovered that Chris had deliberately hooked himself onto the safety buckle to ensure his body remained intact and wouldn't be swept away by the currents. The rescue operation was suddenly at an impasse. After 16 minutes without oxygen, the camera still clearly showed Chris continuing to twitch. They could only watch helplessly as their colleague's life slipped away, unable to do anything. Duncan, positioned in the middle, remained out of contact with the control center, and they couldn't dive to rescue him. The only thing they could do was wait anxiously inside the diving bell. Meanwhile, the operator on the ship continued troubleshooting inside the engine room, preparing to manually rewire the system, bypassing the entire reboot sequence to save as much time as possible. But he had to restore the startup sequence of each module precisely, or it would cause the entire positioning system to crash. Fortunately, after his efforts, the dynamic positioning system finally rebooted successfully. The diving bell also returned to normal shortly after, and the control center quickly re-established contact with Duncan. Upon learning that Chris was right at the top of the manifold, David couldn't wait and immediately stood up, preparing to join the life-or-death rescue mission. But due to the storm causing the ship to drift far from the manifold, they had to quickly adjust course and accelerate to bring the diving bell as close as possible to the target site. At Craig's command, David, who had already been prepared, decisively jumped into the water. Everyone held their breath, staring at the screen, silently cheering for their comrades. Upon reaching the top of the manifold, David immediately checked Chris's condition, seeing that Chris's face had turned blue with no sign of life. There was no time to lose. David hurriedly unhooked Chris's safety buckle and, without hesitation, tied it to himself. He had to race against time, doing everything he could to bring the barely alive Chris back to the diving bell. But dragging nearly 200 pounds underwater and relying solely on arm strength to climb was unimaginably difficult, and the ship, swaying violently in the storm, caused the diving bell to swing back and forth, creating an enormous challenge for David's rescue mission, because if anything went wrong, both of them would be in grave danger. The brave David kept risking everything, struggling desperately at the edge of life and death. But the harsh conditions made David feel helpless. Every time he climbed 1 meter, he would slide down 2 meters. Duncan fully understood the difficulty and told David he had to move in rhythm with the waves. Whenever the diving bell moved downward, he had to climb quickly, and when it ascended, he had to do everything to anchor his body. Under Duncan's guidance, David's rescue efficiency indeed improved significantly, but facing the relentless assault of the storm, David was almost completely exhausted, even briefly considering giving up. Fortunately, with Duncan's constant encouragement, David regained his determination, gritting his teeth and climbing up step by step. Finally, after relentless effort, David managed to drag Chris to the diving bell's lift platform. Upon receiving the signal, Duncan quickly activated the winch, and with David's cooperation, they soon brought Chris inside the diving bell. By then, the oxygen deprivation time had reached 28 minutes. Duncan knew very well that in such circumstances, reviving Chris was almost impossible. Even so, Duncan still used artificial respiration, doing everything in his power to save Chris. Unexpectedly, after several failed attempts, a miracle actually occurred. Seeing Chris react, Duncan was instantly re-energized, dragging Chris while continuously trying to wake him up. But the situation was far from optimistic. Aside from faint breathing, Chris showed no other signs of consciousness.
Well, this connection's spotty. What's Chris's status? Yeah, he is. Chris is breathing. But unresponsive.
They had to accept the cruel fact that after nearly 30 minutes of brain hypoxia, the best outcome for Chris might be becoming a vegetative state. No matter how hard Duncan tried, Chris remained unresponsive. All hope turned to despair, and the heartbroken David told Chris to blink if he could hear them. But the lifeless Chris showed no reaction, his face expressionless. Everything was too late, and the surrounding air seemed to freeze, making everyone's breathing heavy and suffocating. Just as David and Duncan were in utter despair, a sudden sentence broke the silence like a voice from heaven.
Dave. You okay?
Yeah, we're fine, Chris. How are you?
Chris is responsive. And he's talking.
At this point, I believe every viewer was moved to tears with excitement. All of this was thanks to the efforts of every crew member, especially the calm and composed captain.
Get him on.
Hi, Cap.
After 4 days of decompression, every diver finally exited the chamber safely. Although Chris's oxygen supply was cut off for 29 minutes, his body and mind suffered no permanent damage. To this day, experts still cannot give a precise explanation for Chris's survival. Perhaps it was due to the unique combination of water depth and temperature at the time. What's even more admirable is that 3 weeks after the accident, David and Chris, under Duncan's leadership, returned to the seabed to complete the mission they had left unfinished. It must be admitted that the work of saturation divers is always accompanied by life-threatening dangers every single minute. Every time they leave for work, it could be their final farewell, just like what David said at the beginning of the film. Word of advice: once that door closes, everything outside is just a distraction.